Hey guys, so Jason Matthew here from Trinidad and Tobago, and welcome to the Biochem GM YouTube channel. So we're going to start the metabolism line of lectures, and these are some really good reference books that I use. They're in no particular order or in no preference, right? These are some excellent books. Each book will give you a lot of information on metabolism. So please go to your textbooks and see what they have there. They have some really good stuff in these textbooks. All right. If you use a textbook that that's not there and it gives really good information, please send us a link. Let us know. We're always willing to add to the library that we have. Right. So today we're going to be looking at glycolysis, and I have broken it up into 3 parts. All right. So today we're looking at part 1. All right. Now, glycolysis is something that we were probably learning from since O levels into A levels. But the level of detail that I'll be giving you all today is for a level 1 university course. So we're looking at level 1 university course here. So you're gonna see a lot of details in this lecture. All right. So today, what we're going to be looking at? Well, we're going to be looking at the enzyme catalyzed reactions themselves. So for today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the enzyme catalyzed reactions of glycolysis. Anybody knows how many enzymes are involved in glycolysis? Well, all right, if you don't know, that's fine. But at least at the end of this lecture, you should know that answer. All right, and what we're going to be doing in parts 2 and 3? Well, we're going to be looking at the fates of pyruvate and feeder pathways. So that's coming in the subsequent lectures. But today we're going to be looking at the enzyme catalyzed reactions. So before we start, did you know that most of the details of glycolysis, which was the first metabolic pathway to be elucidated, were worked out in the first half of the 20th century? When it comes to figuring out the 10 reactions of glycolysis, 3 scientists come to mind. We have Emden, we have O. Meyerhoff, and we have J. Parnas. Those are the 3 scientists that are well known for elucidating the glycolytic pathway. Now, something even more interesting was that J. Parnas, all right, this guy here, he was a Jewish Polish scientist, and is just a victim of, he was born in a time that was, unfortunately kind of chaotic. It was during the Cold War, and the KGB actually arrested him, all right, and said and claimed that he was a spy for the West, all right, and despite all his international recognition for being a great scientist, the KGB arrested him. And reports say that he died of a heart attack, inverted commas, that is. He died of a heart attack in prison. All right, and I mean, what a waste of a brilliant mind, and it's really unfortunate, and you should do some background reading. It's very interesting. All right, so let's go back to glycolysis now. Now, glycolysis takes place in every single cell of life. Whether it's bacteria or it's yeast or it's plants or animals, glycolysis is universal. It occurs in all life. And it is believed to be the most ancient of metabolic pathways, having arisen prior to the appearance of oxygen in abundance in the atmosphere. So this is how ancient it is. It's before oxygen was one of the main gases in the atmosphere. The oxygen was this was in an anaerobic environment. So before we dive into the actual reactions, all the 10 glycolytic reactions, let's look at this summary chart of glycolysis, and we're going to come back to it a little later on as well. But let's see if we can get the overall picture. So let's look at the word glycolysis. Now, glycolysis could be broken up into 2 parts. The word itself. You have glyco, which is from glucose, and lysis, which means split. So what we are doing is that we are splitting glucose. All right, glycoglucose likes to split. And you're starting off with glucose, which is 6 carbons, and you're going to end up with 2 3-carbon molecules pyruvate. All right, so you're going to end up with 2 molecules of pyruvate, and each pyruvate consists of 3 carbons. All right, now these 10 reactions of glycolysis could be split into 2 phases. You have the energy investment phase, and you have the energy generation phase. And in the energy investment phase, you have 5 enzyme reactions. In the energy generation phase, you have also 5 enzyme reactions. So in total, you have 10 enzyme reactions in glycolysis. When you are converting glucose to 2 molecules of pyruvate, you have to go through 10 enzyme reactions. Now, the enzyme reactions in the energy investment phase consist of 2 irreversible enzyme reactions, meaning that the reaction will go in one direction, they are unidirectional, and you have 3 reversible enzyme catalyzed reactions, meaning that they go in both directions. And in the energy investment phase, you're going to be consuming 2 molecules of ATP. So 2 molecules of ATP is converted to 2 molecules of ADP. Now you might say, well, that sounds a little counterproductive. Isn't the job of glycolysis to produce ATP? Well, that's why we call this stage here the energy investment phase, because it's like in a bank or in business. For you to make a profit, you first have to invest in the business. So you put some money into the business with the hope that at the end you're going to be making a profit. You're going to be making you're going to make more than what you put in. And that's what happens in glycolysis. We are investing to ATP, but you will see later on that we're going to make a profit. So in the energy generation phase now, there are also 5 enzyme reactions. Now, out of those 5 enzyme reactions, one of this reaction will be irreversible, meaning it goes in one direction only, and 4 other reactions will be reversible. They go in both directions, or they can go in both directions, I should say. And in the energy generation phase, you're going to be making 4 molecules of ATP, and you're going to be making 2 molecules of NADH. So to summarize here, for every glucose molecule entering glycolysis, 2 ATP, so that's these 2 ATP here, and 2 NAD plus will be consumed. Alright, and you're going to be making 4 ATP, and you're going to be making 2 NADH. So the net gain, meaning that, remember, in the beginning, in the first energy investment phase, we put in 2 ADP. So it means that this 4 ADP that is generated, we need to pay back that 2. So we make a net gain of 2 ATP. 4 minus 2 will give you this 2 ATP and, well, the 2 NADH that you got. So your net gain when you convert 1 molecule of glucose to 2 molecules of pyruvate will be 2 molecules of ATP and 2 molecules of NADH. So that's just the overall picture of glycolysis, and I hope you got that. All right, and remember this is I want you all to get the big picture before we go into all the details and so on. All right, so let's dive straight into it. So don't be alarmed. We're going to go through this nice and slow, and at the end of the day you're going to figure it out, so don't worry about it too much. But this here are the 10 enzyme reactions of glycolysis, and you're converting 1 molecule of glucose to 2 molecules of pyruvate. And as I said before, you have 10 enzymes involved. It's divided into 2 phases. All right, they call it the preparatory phase and the payoff phase. Same concept, you're going to be first consuming ATP, and then you're going to be generating ATP here in the second phase. So you have 10 enzyme reactions, and we're going to need to know how all 10 of them work. So today, we're just looking at the enzyme catalyzed reactions today, and we're going to be looking at each one. It's very important that we know each one. Now, for the purposes of my course, I wouldn't be testing you all on the actual structures of each of these intermediates here, but I would recommend that you still learn them. Alright, because if you learn the structures, you are going to really appreciate these enzyme reactions that are taking place. But I will not be examining you. I will not ask you in the exam, draw the structure of fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, let's say. Alright, but it will help you understand the process. I recommend it. Alright, so let's dive straight into it now. So that now that we have an overall picture and we have seen all the enzyme catalyzed reactions, let's dive into the first phase here and look at the first 5 enzymes. Alright, so let's look at here. So we are converting glucose. At the end of the first phase, you're going to get 1 molecule of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and 1 molecule of dihydroxyacetone phosphate, and we will see then that will then be converted to 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So you're going to see that at the end. So let's look at the first reaction, and the first reaction is called a first priming reaction. So you're converting glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. In other words, you are adding a phosphate group on carbon 6 of glucose. Alright, now look at the enzyme. So the way to understand this is that you see 1 here, you go and 1 represents hexokinase. Now please guys, for the exam, alright, you are not going to be saying enzyme 1 of glycolysis. You have to name the enzyme. You say hexokinase is converting glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. Please do not tell me enzyme 1. Alright, you might think that that is a no-brainer, but believe me, I have been marking exams for a while now, and it happens. I cannot award you a mark for saying enzyme 1. You need to say hexokinase. Now this is, so glucose going to glucose 6-phosphate. That's a phosphorylation reaction. And the enzyme that is catalyzing it is hexokinase. Now the good news about that, about glycolysis on the whole, is that the enzymes, the names of the enzymes in these reactions, they kind of tell you what the reaction is about. So look at this one, it's hexokinase. Now from your enzymology, you should know that there are 6 major classes of enzymes, and one of them is called transferases, and hexokinase is a type of transferase. And basically what hexokinase is doing is transferring a phosphoryl group, the terminal phosphoryl group from ATP onto our acceptor substrate molecule, and in this case is glucose. And that and the name tells you, it's hexo, as in a hexo sugar such as glucose, and it's kinase, meaning that it's taking the terminal phosphoryl group of ATP and it's adding it on to glucose 6-phosphate. So please note guys, this is something that happens in the exam, and unfortunately I take off marks for. In a phosphorylation reaction, it's ATP going to ADP. Some people are tempted to say ADP plus PI. That is wrong. Alright, in a phosphorylation reaction, the ATP is converted to ADP. There's no free inorganic phosphate. The phosphate, the terminal phosphate that the ATP lost, is transferred to the substrate molecule, in this case glucose, to become glucose 6-phosphate. So it's the first primary reaction, as you probably guessed, or as you look lower down, there's a second primary reaction. Now let's ask ourselves, what is the relevance of this? What is the relevance of converting glucose to glucose 6-phosphate? Well, there are 2 things happening here. First of all, every single cell have glucose transporters, where glucose is free to either come into the cell or to leave the cell. Alright, so every single cell has glucose transporters, and the glucose is free to move. By phosphorylating the glucose and converting it to glucose 6-phosphate, you essentially trap the glucose into the cell, because there are no transporters for glucose 6-phosphate. So once you convert glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, the glucose 6-phosphate cannot leave the cell. So that's one way of the cell trapping glucose. Now by adding a phosphate group to the glucose molecule, you have activated the glucose. You have made it a little unstable, and that promotes the reaction. Alright? Now, and one other thing I want to point out is that if you watch here, you see that there's a single arrow. All right, and a single arrow means that this reaction is irreversible. Under the physiological conditions, this reaction is irreversible. And what we know is that the delta G has a high negative value. And because it has a high negative value going from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, we know that if you go from glucose 6-phosphate to glucose, you're going to have a high positive value with the same numerical value. All right, so you're going to have a high positive delta G if you go from glucose 6-phosphate to glucose. This reaction goes in one direction. And as I stated in the summary chart, all right, in the preparatory phase, there are two such reactions that are irreversible, and we have now met the first one, which is the hexokinase reaction. All right, so we have glucose 6-phosphate now, and we convert glucose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate, and the enzyme that catalyzes this reaction is phosphohexose isomerase, or in some textbooks you might see phosphoglucose isomerase, same enzyme. And basically what you're doing, all you're doing is converting glucose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate. In other words, you're converting an aldose sugar to a ketose sugar. Now, something to pay attention about is that you have the ring structures in both. So it means that you would have to take the aldose sugar, all right, and straighten it out and basically form the ketose sugar. All right, so that's something to think about. All right, now we go to the third reaction, which we're converting fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. And we call this the second priming reaction. It is catalyzed by a very important enzyme called phosphofructokinase 1. Or in other words, we could abbreviate it to PFK1. Now, PFK1 is a very, very important enzyme in terms of regulation. All right, it is the most regulated enzyme of glycolysis. And today we're not going to be talking about regulation, but I just want to throw that out there for you. That PFK1, phosphofructokinase 1, is the most regulated enzyme in glycolysis. Now, there are other enzymes. Hexokinase is one of them as well. But the most regulated enzyme, in other words, the most important enzyme in terms of regulation of glycolysis, is PFK1. And I tend to be very specific. I want you to tell me PFK1, not just PFK, but PFK1, because there's a PFK2 that we will discuss in subsequent lectures when we do regulation of glycolysis and gluconeogenesis. We're going to talk about PFK2, but for now, let's just focus that the enzyme here for the third reaction is PFK1, phosphofructokinase 1. And you're converting fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Now let's look at this. One thing I want to point out here is this, bis. Alright, it is not fructose 1,6-diphosphate. That is incorrect. We use, in biochemistry, we use the term bis because, yes, there are two phosphate groups. Alright, there are two phosphate groups. But look at what's happening. The phosphate groups are not attached to the same carbon atom. If the phosphate groups were attached to the same carbon atom, well, then you could have said diphosphate. But just from the name, it says that the one phosphate is attached to carbons 1, and the other phosphate is attached to carbon 6. So anytime you see in biochemistry and you see in the literature, you see bis, it means that the phosphate groups are on different carbons. If you see di, it means that they are on the same carbon. All right, so that's something to think about. Now, what's the name of this pathway? It's called glycolysis, glyco and lysis. And here in step 4, this enzyme, the aldolase enzyme here, is going to split fructose 1,6-bisphosphate into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Alright, so the splitting is taken here. You're going from a 6 carbon now to 2 3 carbon molecules. You're splitting the 6 carbon molecule, which is fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and you're splitting it to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is 3 carbons. And you can see the structure here, 1, 2, 3, and dihydroxyacetone phosphate, 1, 2, 3. So you have the isomers of each other. And that's the fourth step, and that is catalyzed by the aldolase enzyme. Okay, so we are going through the steps here, and we have covered the first 4. We have one more in the preparatory phase, or the energy investment phase. Alright, and that's a quick question. How many ATP molecules did we consume converting glucose to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate? Well, if you look, the answer is there. It's 1 ATP, it's 2 ATP. So it's 2 ATPs in all that we consume in the energy investment phase or the prep phase. Alright, so we are consuming 2 ATPs so far, and that's for glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Alright, so let's see. So reaction 4, which is the aldolase catalyzed reaction, you have converted fructose 1,6-bisphosphate to 2 molecules. One molecule is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and the other molecule is dihydroxyacetone phosphate, which we could abbreviate as DHAP. Alright, so we have DHAP. So we have one molecule glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and let's call that one G3P. Alright, so we're calling that glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and G3P, and dihydroxyacetone phosphate, DHAP. Now the thing is that if you know a little bit about your glycolysis, you know that dihydroxyacetone phosphate does not continue in the second phase of glycolysis. What happens is that actually this enzyme comes into play here, which is the fifth reaction, which is triose phosphate isomerase. And triose phosphate isomerase will convert this DHAP molecule, is going to convert DHAP to a molecule of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Alright, so what we get in that fifth reaction is a glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, right, plus this glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So in other words, we now have at the end of the preparatory phase, alright, so at the end of the first phase, you have 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So there are 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate at the end of the prep phase that will be entering the second phase. Now before we continue, let's talk about something kind of cool. Triose phosphate isomerase, and in some books they will abbreviate it as TPI, in other books they abbreviate it as TIM, alright, TIM they call it, alright, but triose phosphate isomerase is described as a kinetically perfect enzyme. So what do you understand by the term kinetically perfect enzyme? Well, it means that that as the substrate binds to the active site, there's a reaction. Alright, as soon as the substrate binds to the active site, there's a reaction, and the reaction goes extremely fast. Alright, and the reason for that is that the intermediate for this reaction is very, very unstable. It's a labile intermediate. It breaks down quickly, and to prevent the intermediate from breaking down into something else, the enzyme has evolved a way in that it's very, very efficient. So the substrate is immediately converted to the product. It's a very, very fast reaction. It's a kinetically perfect enzyme, and we're going to be discussing it further when we do level 2 enzymology. But if you're interested, you can give it a read right now. But what I want to just throw out there for you is that triose phosphate isomerase is a kinetically perfect enzyme. Alright, and since we are talking about enzymes and a little enzymology and enzyme reaction, I should have pointed out in the first reaction here for hexokinase. Alright, just to talk a little bit again. All kinases enzymes, they require Mg2 plus as their cofactor. Now let's see if you're thinking, do you know why we need Mg2 plus? Or why it is that Mg2 plus is required? Think about it. What do you know about ATP? Think about the molecule of ATP, because ATP has to bind in the hexokinase active site. Now if you remember about ATP, there are 3 negatively charged phosphate groups on this ATP molecule. What the Mg2 plus does is that it stabilizes the conformation. Right? So it stabilizes some of this negative charge on the ATP molecule. And another thing to point out here is that all these enzymes of glycolysis, they have an induced fit mechanism. So when the ATP binds, it's the Mg2 plus stabilizes conformation. All right. Another thing is that the active site, it has an induced fit in that, and it prevents water from entering, and therefore it prevents the hydrolysis of the ATP. So it's a phosphorylation reaction and not a hydrolysis. All right. So that's a little side note there. So let's recap. We are looking at the preparatory phase or the energy investment phase, and you're converting one molecule of glucose to, at the end, you're going to get 2 molecules of glycerol. And there are 5 enzymes involved in the preparatory phase or the energy investment phase, and let's name them: hexokinase, phosphohexose isomerase, phosphofructokinase 1 or PFK1, aldolase, and triose phosphate isomerase. And these are the reactions here. Alright, of these 5 enzymes, 2 of them are catalyzed reactions only in one direction. They are unidirectional. They can only go in one way, and that is hexokinase and PFK1. These reactions, hexokinase and PFK1, so the first reaction and the third reaction, hexokinase and PFK1 respectively, they go in only one direction because it has a very negative delta G. There's a large negative change in free energy. All right, and once you have a large change of free once there's a large negative change of free energy in one direction, it means that in the other direction is going to be very positive, and the reaction will not be energetically feasible. All right, so there's a lot of energy coming out there in reaction 1 and 3. There's large negative delta G. All right, so that's reactions 1 and 3, and that's why they go in one direction only. To go in the reverse direction, it will require that you will have to overcome a very high activation energy, and it is very energetically unfavorable. So you'll not see reaction 1 or reaction 3. So those are the reactions being catalyzed by hexokinase and PFK1. You're not going to see those reactions going in the reverse direction, but at least with these enzymes. Alright, so there's something to remember. So now that we have conquered, and I hope we have conquered the first stage, the energy investment phase, let's go and attack the second phase now, full force. So the second phase is called the payoff phase. All right, and the reason for that is that we're going to get back our money's worth and some profit. Let's hope. All right, so let's see. The first reaction in the energy payoff phase is that you're going to be converting glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Now if you see here, there are 2 and a 2. What does that mean? It represents how many molecules. Because if you remember from the last stage in the energy investment phase, that triose phosphate isomerase reaction, you had 2 molecules. At the end of the day, you had 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So as we continue on now, it's going to be 2 of everything. So it's 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is going to be converted to 2 molecules of 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. And if you want to call this 1,3-BPG, that's fine. Alright, so 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Now, look at what's happening. It's 2 types of reaction occurring. 2 things happening: oxidation and phosphorylation. So let's look at the oxidation part first. This is the oxidation part of it is a very energetically feasible reaction. And if you look here, you're going 2 NAD plus is going to 2 NADH. So the NAD plus has gained hydrogen. It means that glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate has lost hydrogen and given it to the NAD plus. Alright, so the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate has been oxidized. Alright, and if you look here at the functional groups, you see it's an aldehyde group and it has been oxidized to an acidic group that you will see just now that the phosphate is going to be added to that. Alright, now let's look at the enzyme. It's glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. Alright, now I said it's a phosphorylation reaction, but what is different about this phosphorylation reaction, and let's say a phosphorylation reaction that we saw before, which was catalyzed by hexokinase? Look at the source of the phosphate group in this reaction. It is 2-inorganic phosphate. We are not using ATP as the source of the phosphate group. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be if it's by itself, this would have been a very energetically unfavorable reaction, right? You just can't add phosphate groups like that. All right, we normally have to use a high phosphoryl transfer group, such as from ATP. But the reason why we could add phosphate in the form of inorganic phosphate is because of the oxidation reaction. The oxidation reaction is providing the energy that is needed to add the phosphate group to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to form 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Another thing to point out is that this reaction, reaction 6, that is catalyzed by glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, alright, this reaction here is the only oxidation reaction of glycolysis. Alright, and you're forming NADH. Now, something that we're going to be looking at a lot more in glycolysis part 2 is this here. This is very crucial. NAD plus being converted to NADH. In other words, for glycolysis to continue, NAD plus has to be converted to NADH. If there is no NAD plus in the cell, then glycolysis can't carry on, because step 6, alright, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase wouldn't have any NAD plus for this reaction to occur. And the reason why I'm stressing that is that NAD plus is in low concentrations or low supply in each cell, and cells have devised unique ways to regenerate this NAD plus, because for glycolysis to continue in the cell, you need to regenerate the NAD plus. In other words, you need to convert the NADH back into NAD plus, and we're going to see how the cell does that in part 2. Alright, so that's the oxidation and phosphorylation reaction, and we have formed 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Now, on a side note, I'm going to be doing this in another lecture. 1,3-bisphosphate, 1,3-BPG might be sounding familiar. You may have heard of another molecule that is very similar to this, called 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, or 2,3-BPG. And you will see later on that or you may have heard about it before, but 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate is used in, you may have heard about it when you look at the transport of blood, oxygen in blood. Alright, the 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate will bind to the hemoglobin, making the hemoglobin release its oxygen. And we'll talk a lot more about that later on, but I just thought I should show you that, because I think that's very cool and that's very interesting. So that is something for you to look at. Alright, so the next step now is that you're converting 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate to 3-phosphoglycerate. And the enzyme that is catalyzing that reaction is called phosphoglycerate kinase. Alright, so that's for the 7th reaction. Alright, and this is very important. What we're seeing here is that ATP is being formed. Now the cell can make ATP in 3 ways. One is what we are looking at here, which is called substrate level phosphorylation. Another way in which cells can make ATP is via oxidative phosphorylation, and you would require the mitochondria and the electron transport chain to do that. And the third way in which a cell can make ATP is via photophosphorylation. So that will occur in plants. Alright? So for animals, it will be substrate level phosphorylation and oxidative phosphorylation. And for plants, they have additional one, photophosphorylation. So there are 3 ways in which the cell can make ATP. Substrate level phosphorylation, oxidative phosphorylation, and photophosphorylation. Now, oxidative phosphorylation is where the cell really makes its ATP. Most of the ATP that the cell generates will come from oxidative phosphorylation, which occurs in the mitochondria, as I said before. In glycolysis, ATP is produced by another process which is called substrate level phosphorylation. Alright? And you will see that there are 2 substrate level phosphorylation in glycolysis. And we have come to the first one, and that first one is being catalyzed by phosphoglycerate kinase. Alright, now how is that taking place? Well, 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is a very high energy molecule. Alright, this phosphate that it loses, alright, is a very high energy phosphoryl transfer group. Alright, and basically what's happening here is that the phosphoglycerate kinase is transferring this phosphate group onto ADP. Look at the difference between the 2 molecules here, right? So this phosphate group is being lost, and ADP is accepting it to become ATP, and that's substrate level phosphorylation, where the phosphate is coming from a substrate molecule. Alright, now let me show you something that's cool. Look at this here. Now in this table here, we are looking at the standard free energies of hydrolysis of some phosphorylated compounds. Now look at where ATP is. It has, when it loses that phosphoryl group to become ADP, it gives off minus 30.5 kilojoules per mole of energy. Look at where 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is, minus 49.4, meaning that it gives off a lot more energy. Alright, and this energy could be accepted by an ADP molecule to form ATP. Alright, so these are very high energy molecules. So 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate has a lot of energy that is able to transfer to an ADP molecule. Alright, so it loses this high energy phosphoryl transfer group, and it goes to ADP to become ATP. Now remember, there's a 2 there and a 2 there because it's 2 molecules of 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate going to 2 molecules of 3-phosphoglycerate. And the enzyme that catalyzes this reaction will be phosphoglycerate kinase. Now another important thing to realize now is that at this stage now, at the 7th reaction, you have basically broken even, meaning that the 2 ATP molecules that you used in the energy investment phase has now been paid back. Alright, you now got it back. Alright, so the 2 ATP that was consumed in the energy investment phase, in the first phase, has now been generated again. So you have the 2 ATP coming here. Alright, so you get back the 2 ATP, so you have broken even. Alright, so what you had invested, you now got it back. So you have broken even. Alright, now let's see if we can make some profit. Now the next step here, you have 3-phosphoglycerate being converted to 2-phosphoglycerate. And the enzyme is called phosphoglycerate mutase. Alright, not to be confused with bisphosphoglycerate mutase that would have converted 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate to 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. That's a different enzyme. Alright, so in enzyme 8 here, alright, well the 8th reaction, I should say, the enzyme that catalyzes the reaction is called phosphoglycerate mutase. Alright? Now one might be tempted to say, well, all this reaction is doing is that it's moving the phosphate group from carbons 3 to carbons 2. Well, that's not exactly how that enzyme works. Alright? It's not that simple. In fact, there's an intermediate that it has to go through, a quite stable intermediate, in fact. All right, and this is what happens for the phosphoglycerate mutase reaction. The 3-phosphoglycerate is first converted to 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. All right, and then the 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate molecule, the phosphate group on carbons 3 is removed, and you get 2-phosphoglycerate here. Alright, so again, let's recap. Phosphoglycerate mutase, this reaction here, this enzyme reaction here, this 3-phosphoglycerate is first converted to an intermediate called 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Alright, and then the phosphoglycerate mutase is going to remove the phosphate group on carbon 3, so you get 2-phosphoglycerate. You're going to get 2 molecules of that, right? Reaction 9, enolase. All right, enolase. This, as you see, you're losing water, so that's a dehydration reaction, and you're converting 2-phosphoglycerate to PEP, phosphoenol pyruvate. Now, when you reach PEP, now this is where some serious action is taking place. PEP is a very, very energetically, what's the word here I'm looking for? It has a lot of energy in this molecule, right? PEP has a lot of energy there. And let's look at the table. If you watch, you see that for every molecule of PEP, phosphoenol pyruvate, you could give up 61.9 kilojoules of energy per mole. All right, when it's hydrolyzed. In fact, if you look at these numbers here, you could theoretically, from one molecule of PEP, make 2 molecules of ATP, you know. All right, now this is what's happening. For every 1 molecule of PEP, 1 ATP is being formed, because it's 2, right? So 1 molecule of PEP will give you 1 molecule of ATP. All right, yeah, it's a lot of energy being released there. Now you might ask yourself, wait now, if it's only for each molecule of PEP I'm only getting 1 ATP, where's all this rest of excess energy going? Well, is being lost as heat. All right, and when you exercise, when there's a lot of metabolism taking place in the cell, one of the reasons why you are sweating when you're exercising is from this reaction here. All right, from when you're converting PEP to pyruvate, this reaction here, energy is being released. All right, and it's being released as heat. Well, you're making ATP, but it's also being released as heat, so you sweat. These are one of the reasons why when you're exercising you sweat. All right, and this is a second reaction here, that is the second substrate level phosphorylation reaction. All right, and this reaction is catalyzed by pyruvate kinase. And another thing I want to point out here is that the delta G for this reaction is very negative. All right, so this reaction is the most energetically favorable reaction of glycolysis. All right, it is very, very energetically favorable. All right, a lot of energy is released. Some of it is used to make ATP, some of it will be released as heat. And this is where you make your profit, people. All right, so you broke even in reaction 7 with phosphoglycerate kinase, and now you are making a profit of 2 ATP, so the net gain. So this enzyme, pyruvate kinase, is extremely important in glycolysis, because this is where you're making your net gain. You're making 2 ATP molecules in net gain. Okay, and this one last thing about pyruvate kinase is that, again, this is where you're making your net gain of ATP, all right? And in some individuals, you could have a pyruvate kinase deficiency. Now, it's not a complete deficiency. It's either that they are not making enough pyruvate kinase, or the pyruvate kinase has reduced activity. Now, in videos like that, they run the risk of suffering from hemolytic anemia. Now, there are two common causes of hemolytic anemia. The first one, which is the most common, is a glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, and we'll talk more about that when we do the pentose phosphate pathway. But another way is if you have a pyruvate kinase deficiency. Now, I don't know if I said this before, but the erythrocyte, the mature red blood cell, they solely depend on glycolysis to make their ATP. Now, if there's a deficiency in pyruvate kinase, it means that the erythrocyte is not gaining any ATP. So there's no energy involved. There's no energy for the cell to get, for the red blood cell, the erythrocyte, to get from glycolysis. So the erythrocyte is in a lot of trouble. Now think about it. What are some of the processes, especially like on the membrane, that requires ATP? But you should be thinking about sodium potassium pumps, for instance. And what we're seeing here is that because these sodium potassium pumps are not working, it weakens the membranes, and the cell, the erythrocyte is hemolysis. All right, so this or they're destroyed in the spleen, the erythrocyte, that is, and this person can suffer from hemolytic anemia. So that's something that we'll probably discuss later on, but that's something for you all to consider. So let's just recap one more time. It's the energy payoff phase. All right, there are 5 reactions, and they are catalyzed by glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, phosphoglycerate kinase, phosphoglycerate mutase, enolase, and pyruvate kinase. Now, out of those 5 enzymes, the first 4, or I should say 6 to 9, alright, so glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, phosphoglycerate kinase, phosphoglycerate mutase, and enolase. All those reactions are reversible, meaning that the delta G is close to 0, and it could go in both directions. But for reaction 10, the delta G is negative. Right? It is a very energetically favorable reaction, and it goes in one direction only. So let's remember that for pyruvate kinase. Right, so let's go back to our glycolysis summary sheet. And you have glycolysis, glyco, glucose, lysis, split. And you're starting off with glucose, and you're ending up with 2 molecules of pyruvate. Glucose is 6 carbons, pyruvate 3 carbons, so it's 2 molecules of pyruvate. There are 2 phases, the energy investment phase and the energy generation phase. Alright, there are 10 enzyme reactions in glycolysis. 5 of them belong to the energy investment phase, the other 5 belong to the energy generation phase. Of the 5 enzyme reactions, 2 of them are irreversible. They only catalyze the reaction in one direction only. Can you remember the names of those 2 irreversible enzymes in the energy investment phase? Well, you should be shouting out hexokinase and PFK1, which stands for phosphofructokinase 1. And then there are the 3 reversible reactions. In the energy generation phase, there's 1 irreversible enzyme. Could you remember that guy? You should be shouting out pyruvate kinase for me. I hope you are. Alright. The most regulated enzyme out of the 10 of them is called PFK1. So PFK1 is the most important enzyme in terms of regulation. Next thing to recap, the energy investment phase, you are consuming 2 ATP molecules. In the energy generation phase, you are generating 4 ATP molecules as well as 2 NADH. But because you consume 2 ATP at the start, your net gain is 2 ATP and 2 NADH. So I hope you all got that. Alright guys, so it was kind of long. I hope you got most of it. That's the power of this video. You can always go rewind and take it back again. Alright, and if this video was helpful, please like the video. If you haven't subscribed as yet, please, we're waiting for you all here. Become a biochemian with us. And as usual, give us your comments, give us your feedback. We love hearing from you guys. And these videos, we keep doing these videos because of your support. And I just want to say again, thank you guys. Alright, we really appreciate your support, your feedback. and look out for more videos coming soon. So okay guys, take care. Bye.